thank you very much for that extraordinary introduction. My impulse was to go and join Angelina and let you look at the picture. As a matter of fact, she almost got me into trouble with Fatou. Fatou was on one of these shows, and she noted that when that scene was over, I left and Angelina left too. I don't think that Fatou was being jealous, but I thought if I were only 60 years younger. Well, this is quite remarkable, and I want to pay my respects to all of the distinguished guests here, as well as the honorees. There isn't enough I can say. I will say things which I hope will be news to you. For example, for Marino Ocampo pointed out to you that when I was 27, that was my first case. I will tell him that because of him, my second case was the Lubanga case. Now, I also cannot express my respect for Ambassador Vinavesa and his courageous job and remarkable skill, patience in dragging us through the Kampala exercise, which the Americans hailed as a victory, and it was a victory for them, because they didn't want to be subjected to any international court trying to hold them responsible for aggression. And that point of view was shared by many of the leading powers. And so I've had to accept the fact that we'll have to, if the door to the courthouse is locked, we'll find another way in. And I'll come to that in a moment. But first, let me be brief. As you can see, I'm a small speaker. And I will begin on a date precisely 91 years ago. I arrived in New York Harbor with my parents, fleeing from Hungary and Romania, from persecution and poverty. My father had been apprenticed as a shoemaker, and he bragged that he could make a pair of boots out of a cow's hide. But nobody told him there were no cows in New York, and nobody wore boots. So my earliest memories in the United States, land of promise, was living in a cellar in a place which was known as Hell's Kitchen, very dense crime area in New York. Well, the next question is, well, how did you get from there to here? I told you, I won't bore you with all of the details, and let me just jump. Some of the things has been pointed out in the introduction, but I managed to go through the schools of New York free, City College, Special High School. Harvard Law School gave me a scholarship on my exam on criminal law because I was always interested in crime prevention. I lived in a very dense crime area. Well, no sooner did I get out of law school than I began to practice some of the things I learned. In one of the porticos in the Harvard Law Library, there was an inscription quoting Elihu Root. Elihu Root had been a man who was the Secretary of State and Secretary of War for the United States. Nobel Prize winner, 1912, I think it was. Very learned man. And there it said, "Make us effective for the cause of peace and justice and liberty in the world." And that got engraved on my mind. And that's what I've been doing ever since, or trying to do. In the area of peace, it's been pointed out, I was a combat soldier, landed on the beaches of Normandy, fought in every major battle, managed to survive, for which the Army gave me 5 battle stars, which I thought was very nice. I was a sergeant of infantry at the time. They then called me back and promoted me from sergeant to a civilian. I wouldn't go back into the Army. I was not the military type. Made me a full colonel. When I took over the responsibility for the Einsatzgruppen trial, I was promoted again to general. So I went from sergeant to general in about 6 months. That was rather a record, and I probably was the shortest general since Napoleon Bonaparte. Well, I ran the biggest murder trial in history. 22 defendants convicted of murdering over 1 million people in cold blood, simply because they didn't share the race or the ideology of their executioners. And that included killing thousands and thousands of children who became invisible because they were dead, killed. No remorse, no regrets. And I learned about human nature. My defendants were selected on the basis of their rank. I had 6 SS generals and their education. Most of them had doctorate degrees. So that I began to see that it was not a matter of just wild, cruel people. It's the sort of thing that could happen and has been happening elsewhere. The peace efforts ended with a victory. I don't believe anybody wins in a war. Everybody loses in war. The only winner in war is death. As part of my last responsibilities in the army was to go into the concentration camps as they were being liberated to collect the evidence of the trials. I'm glad to see a Buchenwald survivor here. He looks much better today than the last time. The level of inhumanity which can be practiced was incredible to a rational human mind. And it was pointed out that by that very nice introduction, that I recognized that it would be very, very difficult to change that, but I also learned something, and I'm sharing with you what I learned in my life. One of the important lessons was that it's possible to do what's impossible. And I have to keep reminding myself about that when people say, stop war making, it's impossible. They said the same thing when I talked about creating an international criminal court. And I began talking about that in 1943, writing about it in 1943. I was inspired by the fact that the Wright brothers, who invented the airplane, kept falling on their head. And the world said, if God wanted man to fly, he would have given him wings. Be out of your mind. Well, many of you came here on the planes, which are the result of that impossible dream. And that's not the only one. In the field of human rights, and Navi Pillay is here somewhere, I can't see her because of the light, but 10 years ago, we were together in Guatemala because the government was abusing its own people. The government is no longer there. It seemed impossible then. It's become a reality. The other changes which have been so remarkable, the emancipation of women. When I was at Harvard, there were no women in school. I've been a member of this club for about 40 years. It was only maybe 10, 20 years ago that the Harvard University that it began to admit women to this club. In addition to the emancipation, we have changed the way people think about such important things as race and religion and nationality. We have a black president, inconceivable 25 years ago. So all these things lead me to the conclusion that what is seen as impossible today becomes the reality for tomorrow if you don't give up and keep trying. I set up the restitution program in Germany for Nazi victims. Very little is known about that. Now there's a whole program going on. Another impossible job still. It took about 50 years. The objective was to obtain some measure of compensation for the false imprisonment of innocent people, the suffering they suffered, sustained. No one ever talked about compensation for loss of life. We couldn't measure the value of any human life. But we were trying to get compensation for individuals from a government. That had never happened before. There were no precedents whatsoever. And the government had been defeated, totally destroyed. The country was destroyed. The people themselves were impoverished, starving, homeless. Nevertheless, we continued, and eventually we managed to work out, after 50 years, a period of program which lasted 50 years and is still petering out now, some measure of compensation. So with all of this as my background, I continued my effort to persuade people that law is better than war. It seemed to me a very obvious thing. It's also very obvious that if you want to deter crime, you must let the criminals know that they will be held to account in a court of law. They will be answerable, accountable for their deeds. If you tell them in advance that you will not be held accountable, that doesn't diminish the crime, it increases the crime. That's been tested in many ways. When the courts are closed, the police department goes on strike and so on. And yet, that's what we're doing in connection with war. And I'm not one to take it lying down. If the door to the courthouse is locked, I'll go through the window. If that's locked, I'll go through the roof. And if necessary, I'll go through the basement. So the door is not closed. It is temporarily suspended for an indefinite date after 2017 at the request of the big powers, and I'm prepared to accept that. They are unable politically or morally or whatever, for whatever nationalistic reasons they have, to change in that respect. But we have seen changes. You've seen it here on the screen. A lot of changes. The notion that the sovereign is above the law, king can do no wrong, this was repudiated at Nuremberg. The main thing to come out of Nuremberg was that law applies equally to everyone, including the heads of state and those who are responsible. Of course, aggression was also condemned as a supreme international crime, but it doesn't matter what you call it. It's not a matter of nomenclature. The Russians wanted to call it crimes against peace. But the fact remains that the illegal use of armed force, and by illegal I mean it's not in self-defense, which is permissible. It's not illegal if it's approved by the Security Council. But if those conditions are absent, it's illegal. The illegal use of armed force, if you know in advance that it will inevitably kill large numbers of human beings, that, my friends, in my judgment, is a crime. And I don't care what you call it. Whoever is responsible, I'm talking only about the leaders, not about a few poor people who manage to have to carry that out. But the leaders who inaugurate, participate, and plan and do that action, the illegal use of armed force, inevitably killing large numbers of innocent civilians, should not remain immune from criminal prosecution by an international court. I discussed this briefly with Navi Pillay at the reception here. We will continue on this. She, of course, shared that point of view. And it will take some doing, because people have got to think of legal terminology and so on. I knew René Cassin, who won the Nobel Prize for his work on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The first crime in such declarations is a right to life. Murder is a crime. If the murder of one individual can be a crime against humanity, surely the murder of thousands of innocent children and others is also a punishable crime. So, I'm working on it. I'm working on it. But unfortunately, or fortunately, I'm beginning to suspect that I'm probably not immortal. I'm not ready to prove the point. But one day, perhaps soon, who knows, this banner will slip from my hands. And I hope and I know that it will be picked up by you in this room, those who have been celebrated here and those who have come to honor them. It will be picked up and carried forward. And if you do that, I assure you that your children and the invisible children and your grandchildren and I thank you. Farewell.